He handed me a cheap black vest and told me to be invisible. My son and his wife wanted me to serve champagne while they auctioned off the last piece of my dead wife's memory to strangers. They thought I was just a broken, bankrupt carpenter they could discard like sawdust. They were about to learn that you never insult the man who knows exactly how the structure is held together and exactly how to make it fall apart. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. It helps to know the truth has a witness. Let me back up and tell you how a black tie gala became a demolition site. The tuxedo was a size too small, a cheap rental that smelled faintly of industrial chemicals and other men's sweat. It pinched specifically under the arms, a constant sharp bite against my skin that restricted my range of motion. It was a physical constraint, a tactile reminder of the box I had been forced into. I adjusted the collar, staring at my reflection in the clouded, desilvered mirror of the staff locker room. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a dying flicker, casting the room in a sickly, antiseptic green. The man looking back at me was gray hair that had once been thick and dark, gray skin that looked like parchment left out in the rain. Eyes that had once scanned blueprints for structural weaknesses were now dull, having lost their spark in the grinding friction of survival. My name is Thomas. For 40 years I was a man of substance. I was a structural engineer. I was a master carpenter. I understood how the world held together. I knew that a building, like a life, relies on tension and compression. If the load exceeds the capacity of the column, the collapse is inevitable. I built libraries that smelled of deep oak, beeswax, and history. I restored Victorian homes that had been left to rot, bringing them back to life not with haste but with patience and linseed oil. I knew the difference between a cosmetic fix and a structural repair. I was a creator, a maker. But the economy is a cruel, chaotic wind. It ignores the blueprints. It blows down the strong just as easily as the weak. When the housing market collapsed, the tremors started. My contracts vanished into thin air. Then the real earthquake hit. My wife Sarah got sick. The cancer was aggressive. It chewed through her vitality faster than rotten soft pine. The insurance wasn't enough. It never is. The actuaries and adjusters looked at her life and saw a liability. I saw the only foundation I had ever known. I sold the shop. I sold the tools. My father's tools. Hand planes worn smooth by 2 generations of palms. I sold the house I had built with my own hands. The one where the floorboards didn't squeak because I had shimmed them perfectly. And when Sarah passed, I was left with a silence so loud it felt like a pressure change in an airplane cabin. My ears popped with the emptiness of it. The bank account hovered near zero, a testament to a battle lost. So, at 65, I became a ghost. I took a job at the Obsidian Gallery, the most pretentious auction house in the city. I wore the black vest. I held the silver tray. I learned to blend into the beige drywall, to become a piece of furniture that breathed. "Thomas, move it." The voice cracked like a whip across the small, humid locker room. Kevin, the floor manager. He was 22, with a face as smooth as injection-molded plastic, and a soul just as shallow. He wore a suit that was too blue, too tight, and cost more than the Honda Civic I was currently living out of part-time. He smelled of aggressive cologne and entitlement. "Guests are arriving," Kevin snapped, stepping into my personal space, snapping his fingers in my face. Click, click, champagne. Front room, now. And try to stand up straight. You look like a question mark. I didn't say a word. I didn't tell him that my spine curved, because I had spent 3 decades carrying beams that would crush him flat. I just nodded. It was easier that way. Resistance requires energy, and I was running on fumes. I walked out of the locker room and into the noise. The winter solstice gala was in full swing. The transition from the back-of-house silence to the gallery floor was jarring. The air in the gallery was thick, viscous, with the scent of lilies, expensive perfume, and the metallic, electric tang of money. I moved through the crowd. I was invisible. The wealthy patrons looked right through me. I was not a person. I was a delivery mechanism for alcohol. I was less interesting than the shrimp canapes on the buffet, and certainly less valuable than the abstract splotches of paint on the walls. "Champagne, sir." I offered a glass to a man in a midnight blue velvet suit. He took the glass without looking at me. His eyes were fixed on a piece of modern art that looked like a car crash. He didn't even pause his conversation. "The market is volatile," he said to his friend. a woman dripping in diamonds that caught the gallery lights like shards of ice. We need to liquidate before the quarter ends. Asset stripping is the only way to guarantee the yield. Asset stripping. The phrase made my stomach turn. It was the language of demolition. I moved on, weaving through the tuxedos and gowns. My back ached. A dull, grinding throb started at the base of my spine, lay for an L5 vertebrae, and radiated down to my knees. My knees popped with every step on the polished concrete. Pop. I wanted to go home. I wanted to heat up a can of tomato soup on my hot plate, sit in my second-hand armchair in the basement apartment that smelled of mildew, and sleep until the world made sense again. I wanted to close my eyes and pretend Sarah was in the next room, humming while she read. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the hope. The corrosive, dangerous hope that maybe, just maybe, tonight would be quiet. That I could survive another shift without something breaking. I was wrong. I retreated to my spot near the velvet curtains at the far edge of the room. This was the only safe place. A structural alcove. From here I could calculate the load of the room, the flow of people, the density of the ego without being yelled at by Kevin. Ladies and gentlemen, a voice boomed from the stage, amplified by a sound system that cost more than my education. Mr. Sterling, the auctioneer, stepped into the spotlight. He was a man of polished surfaces. His smile was white, practiced and utterly hollow. He looked like a man who had never held a hammer in his life. Tonight, Sterling announced, sweeping his arm across the room, we have a surprise addition to the catalog. A debut masterpiece from a local artist who has taken the scene by storm. The lights dimmed. The chatter died down, replaced by a hush of expectation. The room held its breath. I leaned against the wall, shifting my weight to my left leg to spare the right knee. I checked my watch. 20 minutes until my break. This piece, Sterling purred, his voice dropping to a reverent whisper, is a study in grief and structural resilience. It is titled The Silent Foundation. My breath hitched. The air in my lungs suddenly felt solid, unmoving. The Silent Foundation, that wasn't an art term. That was a phrase I used in my journals. It was what I called Sarah. She was the caisson, the bedrock, the foundation that held up my world when the winds howled. I had written those words in the margin of a blueprint 16 years ago. 2 handlers wearing white gloves wheeled a large object onto the stage. It was covered in a heavy charcoal gray cloth. The casters squeaked on the floor, a sound of friction. The artist, Sterling shouted, dramatically raising his hand, is the brilliant Mrs. Megan Vance. The name hit me like a physical blow to the sternum. The impact was immediate and breathless. Megan, my daughter-in-law? I blinked, shaking my head. I was sure I was hallucinating. The stress, the age, the fumes of the champagne, the lack of sleep. My mind was finally cracking under the load. But then she walked out. Megan stepped into the spotlight. I was wearing a red silk dress that looked like a fresh arterial wound against the stark white stage. She was beaming. She didn't look like the woman who claimed her marketing business was struggling. She looked confident. She looked rich. She looked like a predator who had just eaten. And there, in the front row, was my son, Patrick. He was clapping. He was wearing a new tuxedo, the fit tailored and precise. But he wasn't looking at Megan. He wasn't looking at the stage. He was looking at his shoes. He was sweating. Even from 30 feet away, under the harsh gallery lights, I could see the sheen on his forehead. He looked like a man waiting for a guillotine blade to drop. Something was wrong. Patrick never sweated. He was an accountant. He was calm, cold. He dealt in numbers, and numbers didn't make you sweat unless they didn't add up. Let's see the piece, Sterling yelled, whipping the crowd into a frenzy. The handlers gripped the corners of the gray cloth. My fingers went numb. The silver tray in my hand felt suddenly impossibly heavy, as if the gravity in the room had shifted. They pulled the cloth. No. My silver tray slipped from my hand. It hit the floor with a deafening clang that cut through the hush of the room. 3 crystal flutes shattered. Champagne exploded across the polished concrete floor, a sparkling radius of destruction, soaking my cheap shoes and socks. The room turned to look at me. Hundreds of eyes. Disdain. Annoying. Kevin started running over from the bar, his face red with rage, his mouth moving in words I couldn't hear. "Thomas, you clumsy idiot." But I didn't see them. I didn't hear them. My world had narrowed down to a single point of focus on the stage. It wasn't a painting. It wasn't a sculpture of abstract nonsense. It was a cabinet. It was Sarah's hope. I had built it 16 years ago, in the agonizing months before Sarah died, when she could still sit in the workshop wrapped in a blanket, watching me. It was made of reclaimed American chestnut wood that technically doesn't exist anymore. Wood I had salvaged from a collapsed barn in 1980, wood that had stood since the Civil War. It was priceless not because of the market, but because of the grain. I had spent 300 hours carving the front panels. They didn't depict gods or monsters. They depicted a bridge being built over a stormy river, the trusses interlocking, the suspension cables taut. It was my way of telling Sarah, in the only language I knew, that we would get to the other side, that the structure would hold. I had hidden it in my climate-controlled storage unit. I told Patrick to keep it safe when I lost the house. "It's the only thing I have left of her," I had told him, handing him the key 2 years ago. "Don't let anything happen to it. It's the archive. Bidding starts at $100,000. Sterling shouted. The number hung in the air. 100,000. 150. A paddle went up. 200. $33,000. A voice shouted from the back. Sold. The gavel slammed down. Crack. Like a bone breaking. I stood there, champagne soaking my socks, the cold liquid seeping between my toes. My son and his wife hadn't just stolen a piece of furniture. They had stolen my grief. They had stolen the last physical manifestation of my love for my wife. And they had sold it to strangers for a vacation fund, or a car, or God knows what. I looked at Patrick, my son, the boy I taught to ride a bike, the boy I taught to measure twice and cut once. He looked up. Our eyes met across the room. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He looked terrified. His eyes were wide, rimmed with red. He looked like a structural column that had begun to buckle. If I exposed them now, screaming in the middle of the gala, it would be a mess. Megan would lie. She was quick, sharp, and ruthless. She would say I was crazy. She would say I gave it to them. She would say the old man has finally lost his grip on reality. Kevin grabbed my arm, his fingernails digging into my bicep. Get out. You're done. You're fired. Get your things and get out before I call security. I didn't look at Kevin. I gently but firmly removed his hand from my arm. The strength in my grip, the grip of a man who manipulated oak and steel for decades, surprised him. He stepped back. I needed more than anger. Anger is a fire. It burns hot and fast, but it leaves nothing but ash. I was an engineer. I needed a blueprint. I needed to understand the load paths. I needed to find the stress point. I crouched down and picked up a large shard of broken glass from the floor. It sliced into the pad of my thumb. A bright bead of red blood welled up. I didn't feel the pain. I felt clarity. I walked out the back door, leaving the mess on the floor. I wasn't invisible in Debur. I was the architect of their ruin. But as I stepped into the cold night air, the rain mixing with the tears I refused to shed, I knew the real betrayal was still waiting in the shadows. I had seen the look on Patrick's face. It wasn't just guilt. It was fear, and fear is a powerful motivator for collapse. The next morning, the sun rose, but it didn't touch me. I sat in my basement apartment, a subterranean box of cinder block and exposed pipes. The air down here was always damp, smelling of earth and wet concrete, the smell of a foundation that hadn't been properly sealed. I sat at my small formica table, my hands wrapped around a mug of instant coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. In the center of the table lay the newspaper I had bought at the corner store. I had smoothed it out with the flat of my hand, pressing the wrinkles away until the headlines stared up at me, crisp and accusing. Local artist Megan Vance stuns with debut. I read the article 3 times, then a 4th. I was looking for a crack in the narrative, a scene where the lie was stitched to the truth. The photo showed Megan smiling, her teeth white and predatory. Her hand rested possessively on Patrick's shoulder, and Patrick, My son looked like a structure that had been stripped of its load-bearing walls. His eyes were hollow, two burnt-out coals and a face that had aged 10 years in one night. I closed my eyes. I saw him at 6 years old, holding a flashlight while I fixed the sink. I saw him at 10, crying because he broke a window. I saw him at 18, leaving for college, promising to make me proud. Somewhere along the line, I had missed a flaw in the material, a hidden weakness in the grain. I needed to know how deep the rot went. Was this just greed, or was it something worse? Structural failure rarely happens without warning signs. Hairline fractures, groaning pipes, shifting ground. I grabbed my coat. It was an old canvas barn coat, stiff with age. I checked my pockets, wallet, keys, and a small multi-tool I never left home without. I drove to Patrick and Megan's house. It was located in the Heights, a subdivision of large modern boxes built 10 years ago. As I drove through the winding streets, I critiqued the construction out of habit. Vinyl siding that would warp in 5 years, roof pitches too shallow for the snow load. It was a neighborhood built on the appearance of wealth, not the substance of it. Their house was the largest on the block, a monolithic cube of gray stucco and glass. I knew the rumors. Patrick's accounting firm had lost 2 major clients last quarter. Megan's marketing business was, as far as I could tell, just a laptop, an Instagram account, and a series of maxed-out credit cards. I parked down the street, tucking my rusted sedan behind the trunk of a large oak tree. I killed the engine. The silence of the suburbs was heavy, unnatural. No birds, just the distant hum of HVAC units, struggling against the morning chill. I waited. My watch ticked. Tick, tick. At 9:11 a.m., the garage door rolled up. Megan backed out in her new Mercedes SUV. It was black, shiny, and aggressive. She didn't look left or right. She just sped off, tires chirping on the asphalt. Patrick followed 2 minutes later in his truck. He drove slowly, his head slumped against the headrest. I gave them 10 minutes to clear the neighborhood. I walked to the front door. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. A warning drum. You shouldn't be here. This is breaking and entering. But I wasn't a burglar. I was a father, performing an inspection. I still had a spare key. Patrick had given it to me 5 years ago, back when we still had Sunday dinners. For emergencies, he had said. This was an emergency. The structure was collapsing. I slid the key into the lock. It turned with a smooth, well-oiled click. I stepped inside. The house smelled of expensive vanilla candles and panic. The air was stale, as if the windows hadn't been opened in months. I walked down the hallway. The hardwood floors were fake, laminate printed to look like oak. I could feel the hollowness of the subfloor beneath my boots. Boxes were stacked in the hallway. Some were open, spilling packing peanuts onto the floor. I went straight to Patrick's home office. It was a disaster. Patrick was meticulous. He was an accountant. He organized his spices alphabetically, but this room looked like a bomb had gone off inside a filing cabinet. Papers were scattered everywhere, across the desk, the floor, the leather chair. Unopened envelopes were piled up like snowdrifts against the baseboards. I started sifting. I moved with the precision of an engineer. Sort, categorize, analyze. I wasn't looking for art. I was looking for the motive. You don't sell your mother's soul for a vacation. You do it for survival. I found the truth in the bottom drawer of the mahogany desk, buried under a stack of Architectural Digest magazines. Red ink, everywhere. Past due notices. A second mortgage letter from the bank, threatening foreclosure. Credit card bills, Visa, Amex, MasterCard. The numbers were staggering. 50,000, 80,000. They were living on a cliff edge, and the ground had already given way. But that wasn't the worst part. Under the stack was a single sheet of heavy, cream-colored paper. It looked elegant, almost like a wedding invitation. I picked it up. The paper was thick, cotton-bonded. It was from a private lender, someone not listed in the phone book. Someone who didn't report to credit bureaus, Marcus Vane. The text was typed in a sharp, serif font. Mr. Vance, the grace period has expired. The extension has expired. Payment is due immediately. Failure to remit the full principal plus interest will result in immediate asset seizure. Please note, if liquid assets are unavailable, physical collateral may be required. I reread the last line. Physical collateral. In the world of Marcus Vane, that didn't mean cars or houses. It meant fingers. It meant kneecaps. My hands started to shake. I dropped the letter on the desk. They were drowning. They were broke. They were being hunted. They hadn't stolen the cabinet because they hated me. They hadn't sold it out of malice. They stole it because they were terrified. They had thrown my heart into the fire to keep the wolves at bay. The sound vibrated through the floorboards. A low, mechanical groan. The garage door, panic, cold and sharp, shot through me. They were back. It had only been 20 minutes. Why were they back? I looked around the office. There was no exit. The window was sealed shut. I heard the door from the garage to the kitchen open. I gave you 2 weeks, Patrick, a deep, raspy voice said. It wasn't Patrick. It sounded like gravel grinding in a mixer. I scrambled backward. I slipped into the walk-in closet in the hallway just outside the office. I pulled the louvered door almost shut, leaving a tiny vertical crack of visibility. I pressed myself back into the coats. The smell of Megan's expensive wool coats filled my nose, suffocating me. Heavy footsteps echoed on the laminate. I peeked through the crack. Patrick was standing in the hallway. But he wasn't alone. A man in a sharp charcoal gray suit stood over him. He was huge, not just tall, but dense. He had a neck as thick as a tree trunk, and a face that looked like it had been chiseled from granite, and then dropped. A pale, jagged scar ran down his left cheek, disappearing into his collar. Marcus Vane, the loan shark. Please, Mr. Vane, Patrick stammered. His voice was an octave too high. He was wringing his hands, a gesture of utter helplessness. The auction was last night. The money, the buyer is transferring it. It comes in on Friday. Marcus didn't blink. He moved with terrifying speed for a big man. He grabbed Patrick by the lapel of his jacket and slammed him against the wall. Thud. The sound was sickening. The drywall cracked behind Patrick's head. A puff of white dust drifted into the air. Friday, Marcus growled. He leaned in close, his face inches from my son's. I don't like Friday, Patrick. Friday is a concept. I like cash. Cash is a reality. It's $30,000, Patrick wheezed, struggling to breathe. I can pay it all, plus the interest. Just 2 days. Marcus held him there for a long second, letting the fear marinate. Then he released him. Patrick slid down the wall, his legs giving out. He hit the floor and curled inward, protecting his stomach. Friday, Marcus said, straightening his cuffs. If the money isn't in my hand by noon, I take the house. I take the car. He paused, looking down at my son with dead shark-like eyes. And then I take your legs. I'll start with the ankles. Marcus stepped over Patrick's legs and walked to the front door. He opened it, then paused. Nice house, Patrick. Flammable, but nice. The door slammed. The house shook. Patrick stayed on the floor. He put his head in his hands and sobbed. It was a raw, broken sound, the sound of a man who has reached his breaking point. I watched my son cry. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run out, to kick the door open, to pull him up, to hug him and tell him I would fix it, like I used to when he scraped his knees on the driveway. I can build a frame around this, I wanted to say. We can shore this up. But I stayed frozen. Because then Megan walked in from the kitchen. She must have been hiding there while Marcus was in the hall. She didn't run to him. She didn't kneel down to comfort him. She walked over to him and kicked the sole of his shoe. Get up, she hissed. Her voice wasn't scared anymore. It was venomous. Stop crying. He's gone. Patrick looked up, his face wet with tears and snot. He's gonna kill me, Megan. Did you hear him? He's gonna cripple me. He's not gonna touch you, she snapped. We sold the piece. The money is coming. We won. Dad loved that cabinet, Patrick whispered, his voice trembling. It was Mom's. I promised him. He's a waiter, Patrick. Megan shouted, throwing her hands up. He's a senile old man who lives in a basement. He probably doesn't even remember he built it, and even if he does, who's going to believe him? I have the press. I have the gallery. I have the narrative. I feel sick, Patrick groaned, clutching his chest. Stop it, she hissed, leaning down, her face contorted with disgust. Be a man for once in your life, Patrick. Solve a problem, instead of creating one. We did what we had to do. That old wood was rotting in a storage unit. It was junk. I gave it value. I made it art. I saved us. She straightened up and brushed invisible dust off her dress. Get dressed, she commanded. We have the final handover with the buyer on Friday night. Mr. Sterling called. He wants a demonstration. Patrick blinked. A what? A demonstration, Megan said, walking toward the closet where I was hiding. My heart stopped. She stopped 3 feet away to check her reflection in the hall mirror. Sterling read some old appraisal report about hidden features. He wants to see the internal mechanics. He wants a show. I don't know how it works, Patrick whispered. Dad never showed me. He tried to, but I wasn't listening. Figure it out, she yelled, her reflection glaring at him. You grew up with him. You spent hours in that dusty shop. Remember something. She turned and marched into the kitchen. I need a drink. Patrick sat on the floor for another moment. Then, slowly, painfully, he pulled himself up, using the wall for support. He looked at the dent his head had made in the drywall. He touched it, wincing. Then he shambled after her. I waited 5 minutes, 10. My legs were cramping. My heart was heavy, dragging in my chest like a wet sandbag. But my mind was clear, cold and clear as winter air. I wasn't just a father anymore. I was an engineer staring at a bridge that had been built on corruption and lies. They needed a demonstration. I slipped out of the closet. I moved silently to the front door. I paused on the threshold. Patrick didn't know how the cabinet worked because he never cared to learn. He saw the wood, but he never saw the craft. He saw the object, but he never saw the love. That was their fatal flaw. I stepped out into the gray morning. They wanted to see the hidden features of Sarah's hope. Good. I would give them a demonstration they would never forget. I couldn't do this alone. A structure is only as stable as its supports, and right now I was a single column bearing an impossible load. I needed leverage. I needed bracing. I drove to the Obsidian Gallery early the next day. The city was waking up, a gray smear of fog lifting off the river. I didn't go to the front entrance with its polished brass handles and doormat that cost more than my monthly food budget. I went around the back, to the service entrance. This was the anatomy of the building that the patrons never saw. The loading dock smelled of diesel fumes, rotting cardboard, and the sour funk of dumpster juice. It was the reality beneath the veneer. I waited by the heavy steel door, shivering in my coat. At 7:15 a.m., the door creaked open. Chloe stepped out, dragging a heavy bag of trash. Chloe was a cleaner at the gallery. She was 19, with bright pink hair that was currently fading to a soft pastel, and eyes that held a permanent look of exhaustion. She was invisible, just like me. We were the ghosts who polished the glass so the rich could see their own reflections. She heaved the bag into the dumpster, wiping her hands on her jeans. Then she saw me. "Mr. Thomas?" She froze, looking around nervously. "You shouldn't be here. Kevin said if you came back, he'd call the cops. He's on a rampage." "I'm not here for Kevin, Chloe," I said softly, stepping out of the shadow of the brick wall. "I need a favor." She looked at me, really looked at me. She saw the lack of a uniform. She saw the fatigue etched into the lines around my mouth. "I heard he fired you," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He's such a jerk. He made me scrub the floor where you dropped the tray with a toothbrush. Said I had to exercise the incompetence." "I'm sorry, Chloe, it's not your fault," she said, shivering in her thin t-shirt. "What do you need?" "The piece," I said. "The cabinet. The silent foundation. The Vance piece," she nodded. "It's all anyone is talking about. Mr. Sterling is obsessed. I need to know about the appraisal," I said. "Every high-value item needs a certificate of authenticity, an evaluation report. Who did it?" Chloe bit her lip. She looked back at the steel door, checking for Kevin. The fear in her eyes was genuine. The fear of losing a minimum wage lifeline. I shouldn't, she whispered. I signed an NDA, a non-disclosure thing. Chloe, I said, stepping closer. I held out my hands, my rough, scarred carpenter's hands. That cabinet, I built it. It was for my wife. Sarah. Her eyes went wide. She looked at my hands, then at my face. She saw the truth there. People who work with their hands recognize each other. We speak a silent language of calluses and cuts. I knew it, she breathed. I knew it wasn't new. The smell, it smells like old dust and memory. Not like the varnish they use now. Who appraised it? I asked again. There was a man, she whispered, leaning in. Last week, an old guy. Looked like a professor. Arthur Pence. He's the best in the city for antique woodwork. I knew the name. Arthur was a purist. He had written books on 19th century joinery. What did he say? He argued with Megan, Chloe said. I was dusting in the hallway. I heard them in the office. He was shouting. He said the wood was American chestnut. He said the oxidizing on the internal latches took decades. He said he wouldn't sign a certificate claiming it was a contemporary debut. He called it a lie. And then, Megan, she got scary. Her voice went all low and cold. She told him that if he didn't sign, she would tell everyone he was senile, that she would ruin his reputation. She said she had friends on the museum board. Did he sign? No, Chloe said. He walked out. He left his papers on the desk. So where did the certificate come from? Chloe looked down at her sneakers. The next day I was cleaning the break room. Megan was at the table. She had a light box, for tracing. She had Miss Bence's rejection letter. Under a fresh certificate. She was practicing his signature. Over and over again. Forgery. It wasn't just a lie. It was a felony. She burned the practice sheets, Chloe said. But she missed one. It fell behind the radiator. I found it when I was sweeping. My heart hammered against my ribs. Do you still have it? Chloe reached into her pocket. She pulled out a crumpled, dusty piece of paper. It was folded into a tiny square. She handed it to me. I unfolded it. It was a sheet of obsidian gallery letterhead. On it, in shaky black ink, were a dozen attempts at the signature Arthur Pence. Thank you, Chloe, I said, my voice thick with emotion. You just gave me the key. Mr. Thomas? She asked as I turned to leave. Are you going to burn it down? I looked back at the gallery, a fortress of glass and arrogance. No, Chloe, I'm going to let them burn it down themselves. I had the motive. I had the witness to the forgery. Now I needed the hammer of the law. I drove to the fourth. The building was a brutalist block of concrete that looked like a bunker. I walked to the front desk. I need to speak to Detective Richard Thorne. Fraud Division, do you have an appointment? The officer asked, not looking up from his phone. Tellin' Thomas Vance is here. Tellin' his kitchen island is listing. The officer looked up, confused, but he made the call. 5 minutes later, Richard Thorne walked into the lobby. Richard and I went back 30 years. I had renovated his kitchen when he was just a beat cop with a growing family. We played chess on Sundays for a decade until Sarah got sick and I stopped going out. He looked older now, heavier. The lines on his face were deep trenches of stress. He wore a cheap suit and a tie that was loosened at the collar. Thomas, Richard looked at me, scanning my face with a detective's eye. He saw the gray skin, the cheap clothes, the desperation. You look like hell, Tom. Good to see you too, Richard, I said. He ushered me back to his desk. It was buried under files. The precinct smelled of stale coffee and ozone. Sit, he said. He didn't offer me coffee. He knew I wouldn't take it. What brings you here? I haven't seen you since the funeral. I need to report a crime, Richard, I said, placing my hands on his desk. But I don't want an arrest. Not yet. That's not how it works, Tom. If a crime's been committed, we book him. I want a warrant, I said, and I want you to be at the Obsidian Gallery on Friday night. Richard leaned back in his chair, the springs groaning. He studied my face. This is about the cabinet, isn't it? The Silent Foundation? I saw the article in the paper. I saw the name, Megan Vance. It's about more than the cabinet, I said. It's about the foundation of everything. They stole it, Richard, Patrick and Megan. They stole Sarah's memory, and they forged an appraisal to sell it. I slid the crumpled paper Chloe had given me across the desk. Richard picked it up. He put on his reading glasses. He looked at the practice signatures. Forgery, he muttered. Arthur Pence. I know him. He's a straight shooter. If they faked his mark, that's serious time. Wire fraud, too, if they transmitted the sale docs electronically. I want them to hand it over, I said. I want to prove it in front of the buyer. I want the lie to collapse in public. Richard sighed. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. You want a sting, he said. You want theater. I want justice. Thomas, Richard said, his voice changing. It wasn't the voice of a friend anymore. It was the voice of a cop. Be careful what you ask for. We've been tracking a private lender, a shark named Marcus Vane. I froze. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Vane, I whispered. We have a wiretap on Vane's associate, Richard said quietly. Your son's name popped up in the ledger 2 weeks ago. He's in deep, Thomas. 6 figures deep. Vane isn't a bank. He doesn't foreclose on houses. He forecloses on people. I looked at the floor. The linoleum was scuffed and scarred. I saw him, I admitted. I saw Vane at Patrick's house this morning. He threatened to take his legs. Richard slammed his hand on the desk. And you didn't call 911? Patrick wouldn't talk, I said. He's terrified. If I call the cops now, Vane disappears. And the debt remains. Patrick needs to hit the bottom, Richard. He needs to see that the lie won't save him. You're playing a dangerous game, Richard said. If this goes south on Friday, Vane might decide to cut his losses. Literally, I have a plan, I said. But I need you there to make the arrest. When the truth comes out. Can you do it? Richard looked at the forged signatures. Then he looked at me. He remembered the kitchen I built him. He remembered how I reinforced the joists, 'cause I knew his kids would jump off the counters. Friday night, Richard said, I'll be there. I'll bring a team. But Thomas, if your son is involved in the fraud, I can't protect him. The law is a blunt instrument. I stood up. I buttoned my coat. My son is already gone, Richard, I said, my voice hollow. I'm just trying to save the man who ate him. I walked out of the station. The pieces were in place. The witness, the law, the motive. Now I just had to set the table. 2 days later, I invited them to dinner. It was a tactical maneuver disguised as hospitality. I needed to look them in the eye one last time. I needed to calibrate the load before I pulled the pin. I spent the afternoon preparing. I made meatloaf. It was Patrick's favorite, a recipe Sarah had perfected over 30 years. A dense, savory brick of comfort food, mixed with onions, breadcrumbs, and a glaze of brown sugar and ketchup. The smell filled my small basement apartment, masking the damp, metallic scent of the pipes that ran along the ceiling like exposed arteries. I set the table. I only had 2 matching plates left from our old life. The third was a chipped piece of stoneware I'd found at Goodwill. I gave the chipped one to myself. I laid out the silverware, polishing the water spots off with a rag. The tension in the room was suffocating long before they arrived. The air felt heavy, charged with static. I sat in my armchair, listening to the footsteps of the tenants upstairs, waiting for the sound of the doorbell. At 7 p.m. sharp, it rang. I opened the door. Megan stood there, framed by the peeling paint of the door. She was wearing a diamond necklace that caught the dim hallway light, a glittering choker of ice that I knew, with an appraiser's certainty, cost more than my rent for a year. She wore a silk blouse and a blazer, dressed for a boardroom, not a basement dinner with her father-in-law. Thomas, she exclaimed, leaning in to air-kiss my cheek. She smelled of expensive perfume and gin. It's so good to see you. We've been meaning to call, really. Patrick stood behind her. He looked like a man who was slowly dissolving. His suit hung off his frame. His skin was the color of old dough. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He kept rubbing his left arm, a nervous tic I hadn't seen since he was a child waiting for report cards. Hi, Dad, he mumbled. Come in, I said, stepping back. Dinner is ready. We sat at the small, wobbly table. The overhead light was harsh, casting long, sharp shadows across their faces. I served the meatloaf, mashed potatoes with lumps, just the way Patrick liked them. Green beans. Patrick stared at his plate. He'd picked up his fork, his hand trembling slightly. The metal clattered against the china. "So?" I said, pouring tap water into their glasses from a plastic pitcher. "How are things?" "Truly. Great," Megan said, too loudly. Her voice bounced off the cinder-block walls. Her smile was a rictus of tension, bright and tight. It didn't reach her eyes. Her eyes were scanning the room, judging the poverty, calculating how soon they could leave. "Business is booming," she continued, cutting a piece of meatloaf with surgical precision. "My agency just signed 2 new tech startups. In fact, Patrick and I are thinking of buying a vacation home. Something on the lake." I watched Patrick. He flinched at the word lake. "Is that right?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "That takes a lot of capital. The market is tight." "We came into a bonus," Patrick mumbled to his potatoes. He stabbed the meatloaf, destroying the structure of it. "Neat. Performance bonus." "That's wonderful," I said. "I'm glad to hear you're building a future." I took a bite of food. It tasted like ash. The silence that followed was thick. The only sounds were the scraping of forks and the low hum of my refrigerator compressor kicking on. I looked at my son. I looked for the boy who used to help me sand deck chairs. I looked for the young man who cried at his mother's bedside. I saw only a stranger in a suit that didn't fit. "You know," I said, laying my fork down gently, "I was thinking about your mother today." The air left the room. Patrick froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. "I was thinking about that old cabinet I built for her," I continued, staring at the salt shaker. "Sarah's hope. I miss working with my hands. I'd like to get it out of your storage unit, maybe polish it up. Bring it down here. It would fit in the corner." Patrick choked on his water. It was a violent, spasmodic reaction. He coughed, his face turning a violent, blotchy red. Water sprayed onto the tablecloth. Megan dropped her fork. It clattered against the plate with the sound of a gunshot. "Oh, Thomas," she said. Her voice dropped instantly into a register of fake, dripping sympathy. It was a performance. She reached across the table and patted my hand. Her hand was cold, clammy, like handling a dead fish. We didn't want to tell you," she said, shaking her head sadly. "Tell me what?" I asked, widening my eyes. "Is it damaged?" "There was a flood," she lied. The lie came out smooth, practiced. "A flood?" I asked. "At the climate-controlled storage unit on high ground?" "Yes." The pipe burst. "Last month," she said, her eyes locking onto mine, daring me to challenge her. "It was awful. Everything was ruined. Black mold, rot. The water sat there for days before they found it." "You threw it out?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I looked at Patrick. "My tools, my drawings, the cabinet I built for your dying mother." Patrick looked up then. His eyes were wet, swimming in panic and shame. "It was a health hazard, Dad," he whispered. The lie tasted bad in his mouth. I could see him trying to swallow it. The mold, it was everywhere. We had to hire a hazmat crew. We trashed it all. "You trashed it," I repeated. "It was just wood, Thomas." Megan said dismissively, retracting her hand. "Rotting wood? We saved you the heartbreak of seeing it." "I see," I said. I looked at my son. I gave him silence. I gave him 10 seconds. The engineers count. 10 seconds to test the load before declaring the structure unsafe. 10 seconds to tell the truth. To say, "Dad, we're in trouble. Dad, we sold it because a man is going to break my legs. Dad, help us." 1, he drank his water, his knuckles white around the glass. 2, he looked at the door, measuring the distance to freedom. 3, he looked at Megan. She glared at him, a sharp, warning look that said, "Keep your mouth shut." 4, he looked at his hands, the hands I had taught to hold a hammer. 5, he wiped his mouth with the paper napkin. He was sweating now, beads rolling down his temple. 6, he opened his mouth. My heart leaped. 7, he closed it. 8, he picked up his fork again. 9, he took a bite of the meatloaf. He chose the lie. He chose the comfort of the moment over the pain of the truth. 10, the bridge collapsed. "Well," I said, standing up. My chair scraped loudly against the concrete floor. Things are just things, right? Wood rots. Iron rusts. As long as family sticks together. Exactly, Megan said, relaxing visibly. She took a huge gulp of her wine, draining the glass. Family is everything. You have to look out for your own. She had no idea that she had just severed the last tie. She had no idea that she was sitting in a room with a man who had just decided to let the roof fall in. I'll clear the plates, I said. I walked into the kitchenette. It was separated from the living area by a half wall. I turned on the faucet full blast. The water roared into the metal sink. I gripped the edge of the counter. I gripped it so hard the laminate cracked under my thumb. I didn't cry. I was past tears. Tears are for grief. This was something colder. This was demolition. They had looked me in the eye and erased my history to pay for their mistakes. They had buried my memories in a flood that never happened to save a debt they were too cowardly to admit. I washed the plates. I scrubbed them until they squeaked. My hands were shaking. Not from fear, from rage, a cold, calculating rage. I dried my hands. I turned off the water. I walked back out. Thank you for coming, I said. I'm tired. I think I'll turn in. Of course, Megan said, standing up quickly. We have an early start anyway. Big day Friday. Yes, I said, opening the door. Big day. Patrick paused at the door. He looked at me, and for a second, the mask slipped. Thanks for the meatloaf, Dad, he whispered. It tasted like home. Drive safe, Patrick, I said. I closed the door. I locked the deadbolt. Click. I listened to them walk up the stairs. I heard Megan laugh at something on the landing. I went back to the table. I sat in my chair. I looked at the empty seat where my son had sat. Friday night, I wasn't just going to crash the party. I was going to bring the whole house down. Friday night arrived with a torrential downpour. The rain lashed against the glass facade of the obsidian gallery, blurring the city lights into streaks of neon and gray. It was the kind of weather that tests roofs and floods basements, weather that exposes leaks. The gallery was packed. This was the handover ceremony, an event designed solely to stroke the ego of the buyer and validate the price tag. I was working. I shouldn't have been. Kevin had fired me, scrubbed my name from the roster, but Maria, the head of catering, was an old soul from the neighborhood. She remembered when I fixed her mother's porch for the cost of materials. When I showed up at the service door at 5:00 p.m., wet, and holding my old uniform, she didn't ask questions. She just handed me a tray and put a finger to her lips. Stay in the back, Thomas, she whispered. Kevin is on the warpath. I nodded. I put on the black vest. It fit tighter than before, or maybe I was just holding myself differently. I wasn't slumping anymore. I was bracing. I stood in the deep shadows near the kitchen swing doors. Under my serving tray, taped to the underside with gaffer tape, was a copy of the forged appraisal Chloe had helped me find. It was my demolition charge. The room was a sea of black ties and sequins. The air hummed with the meaningless chatter of people who had never worried about a heating bill. The cabinet, Sarah's hope, sat center stage on a raised plinth. It was bathed in a spotlight that made the reclaimed chestnut glow with an inner fire. It looked regal. It looked lonely. Richard Thorne he stood near the main exit, looking uncomfortable in a tuxedo that was a size too large. He wasn't drinking. His eyes scanned the room, professional and cold. He looked like a cop waiting for a bank robbery to start. Chloe was watching from the hallway door, clutching a stack of napkins she didn't need. She caught my eye and gave a subtle, terrified nod, but there was another guest. The variable that changed the equation. Marcus Vane. He stood in the far corner, near the velvet ropes. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He wore a dark gray suit that looked expensive but menacing. He held a glass of scotch that he didn't drink. He wasn't looking at the art. He wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking at Patrick. Patrick was standing near the stage stairs. He was vibrating. Sweat had soaked through the collar of his shirt. He looked like he was going to vomit. Every time he shifted his weight, his eyes darted to Vane. Vane would catch his eye and smile, a slow, shark-like baring of teeth. He checked his watch pointedly. Tick, tick, and now Megan's voice boomed over the speakers, cutting through the ambient noise. She stood on the stage, radiant. She wore a gold dress that shimmered like liquid metal. She looked triumphant. She had no idea she was standing on a trapdoor. "Ladies and gentlemen," Megan announced, gripping the microphone, "tonight is a celebration of vision, of transforming the discarded into the divine. I am so proud to officially present the Silent Foundation to its new custodian." Applause rippled through the room. Polite, expensive applause. Mr. Sterling, the billionaire buyer, stepped up to the podium. He was a short man with eyes like flint. He didn't clap. He looked at the cabinet with the possessive hunger of a collector. "Mrs. Vance," Sterling said, his voice amplified and crisp, "my curators have been examining the provenance. They tell me this piece is unique, one of a kind." Megan beamed. "Indeed," Sterling said. "I read the appraisal report you provided. The one by Mr. Pence." My hand tightened on the tray. "It mentions a unique locking mechanism," Sterling said. "A puzzle lock integrated into the joinery."
"A lost art."
Megan froze. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second. What?" "A puzzle lock," Sterling repeated. He turned to the crowd. "I am a man who appreciates mechanics. Before I sign the final check, I would like to see the central safe opened." "I want to see the heart of the piece." Megan laughed. It was a high, brittle sound. It sounded like glass breaking in a quiet room. "Of course. It's quite stiff. The humidity, you know. The wood expands." "We have climate control," Sterling said, his face impassive. "Please, show us." The room went quiet. The chatter died. The tension on stage was palpable. Megan approached the cabinet. She looked at it as if it were an alien artifact. Iz reached out and grabbed the center handle, a piece of hand-forged iron I had hammered out myself. She pulled. Nothing happened. The door was solid. She pulled harder. Her knuckles turned white. The cabinet rocked, slightly on the plinth, the heavy wood groaning. "It seems to be stuck," she said, chuckling nervously. Sweat beaded on her forehead, ruining her perfect makeup. "Try the hidden latch," Sterling suggested, crossing his arms. "The report says it is intuitive to the creator." Megan froze. "Hidden latch?" She started pressing random spots on the wood. She pressed the molding. She pressed the side panels. She was panicking now. Her movements were jerky, ungraceful. She was scratching the finish with her diamond rings. She looked at Patrick. "Patrick," she hissed away from the mic, but loud enough for the front row to hear. "Help me." Patrick looked at Vane. Vane was staring at him, tapping his watch. Patrick walked up the stairs like a man walking to the gallows. He stood next to the cabinet. He knew, somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew I had built tricks into it. I had tried to show him when he was 20. "Look, son, it's a gravity latch. You have to lift it before you pull." But he had been on his phone. He never learned the language of the wood. Patrick grabbed the handle. He yanked it violently. Clack thud. It didn't budge. I don't know," Patrick whispered. "It must be broken." "Broken?" Sterling asked. His voice dropped to a dangerous chill. "Or perhaps you don't know how it works." The crowd began to murmur. I heard whispers. Fraud. Fake. Embarrassing. Megan snapped. "I built it," she shrieked, her composure shattering. She kicked the base of the cabinet. "It's just old. It's garbage wood. It's moody." "It is not old," a voice said. It was my voice. I didn't shout. I didn't have to. The acoustic design of the room carried it perfectly. I stepped out from the shadows. I walked through the crowd. The patrons parted for me not because I was a waiter, but because of the way I was walking. I wasn't shuffling. I was marching. I reached the front. I set my tray down on the stage steps with a heavy, deliberate clink. The room turned. "Who is this?" Sterling asked, looking down at me. Kevin appeared from nowhere, his face purple. "Thomas. Security. Get him out of here. He's a fired employee. He's drunk. He's my father-in-law." Megan screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me. "He's senile. He's confused. Get him out." Two large security guards stepped forward, reaching for my arms. "Hold on." The voice cut through the chaos like a knife. Detective Thorne stepped out from the crowd. He didn't look tired anymore. He held up his gold badge. It gleamed under the gallery lights. "Police," Richard said. Nobody's in. Let him speak." The guards backed off. Kevin froze. The room went deathly silent. Even the rain outside seemed to hold its breath. I walked up the stairs. My knees didn't hurt. My back was straight. I felt the ghost of Sarah's hand on my shoulder. I looked at Megan. Her eyes were wide with terror. She looked small. I looked at Patrick. He looked at me. And then he looked at Marcus Vane. Dane hadn't moved. He was watching the play unfold with cold curiosity. "Mr. Sterling," I said calmly, turning to the billionaire, "the cabinet has entered defense mode. It happens when the wrong pressure is applied. It protects the contents from thieves." Sterling raised an eyebrow. "And how do you know that?" "Because I built it," I said, "for my wife, Sarah, 16 years ago. In my Mars." "Liar," Megan yelled. She lunged at me, her nails aimed for my face. Patrick caught her arm. "Stop," he whispered. "Just stop, Megan. He's jealous." Megan shouted, struggling against Patrick's grip. "He's a failure. He's a bankrupt carpenter trying to steal my credit." I turned to her. I looked her in the eye. "If you built it, Megan," I said softly, "tell us the combination. Is it a number? A key? A series of levers?" She stared at me. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish on a dock. She had no idea. She thought it was just a box with doors. She stammered. "I forgot. In the heat of the moment, you can't forget the combination, Megan," I said, "because the combination is a story, and you don't know the story." I turned back to Sterling. "Mr. Sterling," I said, "if I can open this cabinet without a key, without force, will you believe me?" Sterling looked at Megan, sweating and manic. Then he looked at me, calm and gray. He looked at my hands. He saw the scars. He saw the sawdust permanently etched into the fingerprints. "If you can open it," Sterling said, "the truth is yours." I stepped toward the wood. The trap was sprung. Now, I just had to close the jaws. The silence in the gallery was absolute. 600 people, collectively holding their breath. The only sound was the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the high windows, a natural counterpoint to the artificial tension in the room. I stepped up the plinth, up close, under the unforgiving heat of the spotlights. The cabinet was even more beautiful than I remembered. My heart ached. It wasn't just furniture. It was a diary carved in grain and relief. I placed my hands on the wood. It didn't feel like an object. It felt warm, almost alive. The American chestnut had a specific texture, silky but dense, vibrating with a history that predated this building, this city. It felt like holding Sarah's hand. I closed my eyes for a second, blocking out the staring crowd, the sweating sun, the furious daughter-in-law. I was back in my garage. It was 2000 at Sarah. Sarah was sitting in the corner in her wheelchair, wrapped in an afghan, her breathing shallow but her eyes bright. "Make it strong, Thomas," she had whispered. "Make it last." I opened my eyes. I didn't pull the handle. That was for tourists. That was for people who looked but didn't see. I moved my right hand to the top corner of the relief carving. There was a cluster of oak leaves carved there. I pressed the third leaf from the left. Click. It was barely audible. A tiny, precise shift of an internal tumbler. Megan gasped. "What are you doing? You're breaking it!" I ignored her. I moved my left hand to the bottom panel, where I had carved a rushing river. There was a smooth, rounded stone jutting out from the water. I pressed the river stone. Click! A second tumbler engaged. The harmonics of the cabinet changed slightly. The tension inside was shifting. Finally, I placed both hands on the center panel, the bridge. The bridge I had carved to carry us over. I pressed down on the keystone arch of the bridge. Click! The sound was soft, like an exhale, like a breath held for 16 years finally being released. But the door didn't open, not yet. I leaned in close to the wood, intimate with my creation. I tapped the underside of the kern molding with my knuckle, 3 distinct times in a specific rhythm. Tap, tap. It was Sarah's favorite beat. A waltz time. The reaction was instantaneous. Whirr, clunk. A deep, resonant sound came from deep within the chest. The sound of heavy wooden gears I had cut by hand from dense quarter-sawn oak, soaked in linseed oil for weeks, disengaging. The deadlock, a mechanism of gravity and friction that no key could turn, released. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Mr. Sterling leaned forward, his eyes wide with genuine, unmasked wonder. I reached out and took the center handle, the one Megan and Patrick had uselessly yanked on. I didn't pull. I guided. The heavy center panel didn't just swing open. It slid forward first, then rotated smoothly on hidden brass pivots, gliding on the pressurized air cushions I had engineered into the frame. It opened with the silent, heavy grace of a bank vault door. The interior was revealed. It wasn't empty space. It was a complex honeycomb of small drawers and cubbies, all made of lighter, aromatic cedar. But in the very center, in a velvet-lined cavity designed to hold exactly one thing, rested an object. I reached into the compartment. My hands trembled, not from age, but from reverence. I pulled out a small book. It was bound in worn red leather, the edges frayed from use. "This is not an appraisal," I said, my voice thick, struggling to stay steady in the cavernous room. "This is Sarah's journal." I held it close to my chest for a moment. The leather smelled faint of her lavender hand cream. "I locked it inside the day she died," I whispered to the silent room, because I couldn't bear to read the end. I opened the front cover. The spine cracked slightly. I held it up toward the nearest camera crew, illuminated by the blinding flashes. On the first page, written in my own looping, forceful handwriting, was the inscription, "To Sarah, my foundation, my keystone, built by the hand and heart of Thomas Vance, 2008. May this hold what I cannot." The image was beamed onto the large screens flanking the stage. The truth, written in ink and wood, was undeniable. I looked at Megan. The fight had left her. The arrogance, the fury, the desperate calculations. It all evaporated. She collapsed into the chair behind her, her golden dress pooling around her like spilled paint. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. It wasn't remorse. It was the sheer terror of exposure. I looked at Patrick. He wasn't looking at the floor anymore. He was looking at me. Tears were streaming down his face, carving tracks through the sweat. Silent, ugly tears. He looked devastated. He looked like a building that had finally succumbed to the rot inside the walls. He hosed 2 words across the stage. "I'm sorry." I looked at him. I saw the boy I loved, buried under layers of cowardice and debt. "I know," I thought. But sorry doesn't rebuild the foundation. Movement caught my eye. Richard Thorne walked up the steps onto the stage. He pulled a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. The metal glinted coldly. He walked past Patrick. He walked to the chair where Megan sat. "Mrs. Megan Vance," Richard said, his voice flat and official. "Please stand up. You are under arrest." She looked up, her mascara running down her cheeks in black streaks. "For what?" she sobbed, her voice thin and childlike.
"I didn't know. I just wanted to fix things."
"Grand larceny, wire fraud, forgery in the first degree." Richard listed the charges like he was reading a grocery list. He pulled her up. She didn't resist. The click of the handcuffs was loud and final. Richard handed her off to a uniformed officer, then turned his attention to the corner of the room. Marcus Vane was gone. The spot where he had stood was empty. The shark had smelled blood in the water, but it was the wrong kind of blood. He cut his losses. He wouldn't get his money tonight, but he wouldn't get arrested either. The immediate physical threat to my son's legs vanished with him, but the debt remained. The consequences remained. Richard walked over to Patrick. Patrick didn't run. He didn't argue. He looked at the exit where Vane had been, breathed a shuddering sigh of relief, and then looked back at Richard. He straightened his jacket. He held out his wrists. "I'm ready," Patrick said softly. I watched as Richard cuffed my son. I watched as they led him down the stairs, past the staring socialites, past the champagne fountains, toward the exit. Patrick looked back one last time before they pushed him through the doors. His eyes met mine. There was no plea in them, just a profound, crushing acceptance. The doors closed. I was alone on the stage with Sarah's hope. Mr. Sterling walked up the steps. He approached the cabinet slowly, respectfully. He ran a hand over the open door, marveling at the joinery. "Mr. Vance," Sterling said, turning to me. His voice was completely changed. The salesman was gone. The connoisseur remained. I apologized profoundly. This piece, the engineering, the artistry, it is masterful. It is beyond price. I gently closed the journal and placed it back in its compartment. "It's not for sale, Mr. Sterling," I said. "I understand completely," Sterling said, nodding slowly. He reached into his tuxedo pocket and pulled out a heavy cardstock business card, embossed in gold. "But if you ever decide to build anything at all, call me. I will be your patron." He handed me the card. I took it. Sterling turned and addressed the stunned room. "Ladies and gentlemen, the auction is cancelled. Please finish your drinks and depart. Good night." The room began to clear. The noise returned, but it was subdued now. The whispers were different. I stood on the stage as the room emptied. I looked at the cabinet. I wasn't invisible anymore. I felt the weight of my own body. I felt the floor solid beneath my feet. I was Thomas Vance, the maker, and the foundation held. The fallout was swift, violent, and public. In structural engineering, we call it progressive collapse. When one critical load-bearing element fails, it transfers its load to the surrounding members. If they can't handle the strain, they fail too, creating a chain reaction that brings the entire building down. The Obsidian Gallery remained closed for a week. The police tape across the front doors was a bright yellow sash of shame. The scandal was the only thing the local news wanted to talk about. The art of the steal, the headlines read. The forger in the silk dress. I didn't read them. I didn't watch the news. I went back to my basement apartment and stared at the water stains on the ceiling. Mr. Sterling sued Megan for fraud. It was aggressive, scorched earth lawsuit. The state prosecutor, smelling a high-profile win, added charges of elder abuse and conspiracy to commit grand larceny. The legal process was a cold, sterile machine. It ground them down slowly. I attended every hearing. I sat in the back row, wearing my one good suit, a gray wool number from 1995 that smelled of mothballs. I wasn't there to gloat. I was there to witness the demolition I had triggered. Megan went first. She fought it. She fought it with a delusion that was almost impressive in its durability. She fired 3 public defenders. She stood in the dock, wearing an orange jumpsuit that clashed horribly with her pale, angry skin, and told the judge that she was the victim of a patriarchal conspiracy. She claimed I was senile, that I had given her the cabinet, that I was changing my story for attention. She never looked at me, not once. To her, I was just the glitch in her programming. The jury didn't buy it. The forensic evidence, the forged signatures, the wiretap records Richard Thorne had subpoenaed, was overwhelming. Megan was sentenced to 4 years in a federal correctional facility. As the bailiff led her away, she didn't cry. She just looked at the gallery of spectators, scanning for a camera, desperate for an audience until the heavy door slammed shut. She blamed everyone but herself until the very end. Then it was Patrick's turn. My son looked different. The softness was gone. He had lost 20 pounds in jail awaiting trial. His suit hung off him like a shroud. He pleaded guilty. No deal, no negotiation. He just stood up and said, "I did it." The prosecutor wanted 3 years. They wanted to make an example of the accountant who cooked the books. I asked to speak to the judge. My lawyer, a kind woman provided by the court, advised against it. "It might look like you're condoning the crime, Mr. Vance." "I'm not condoning it," I told her. "I'm explaining the stress fractures." I walked to the front of the courtroom. My hip was aching. The wood of the witness stand was cheap veneer, peeling at the corners. I looked at the judge. He was a man my age with tired eyes. "Your Honor," I said, "my son is not the architect of this disaster. He is a load-bearing wall that was subjected to more pressure than he was rated for." I looked at Patrick. He was weeping silently, his head bowed. "He is weak," I continued, my voice steady. "He is cowardly. He betrayed me, and he betrayed the memory of his mother, but he did not conceive the malice. He was eaten alive by a lifestyle he couldn't afford and a wife he couldn't say no to. Sending him to prison will not fix him. It will only finish the destruction. The courtroom was silent. He needs to work, I said. He needs to sweat. He needs to understand the value of a dollar earned, not stolen. The judge took off his glasses. He looked at Patrick, then at me. Patrick received 5 years of probation and 2,000 hours of community service. But there was still the money, the fines, the legal fees, the restitution to the gallery for the disrupted business. It totaled nearly $80,000. Patrick didn't have it. He was bankrupt. His house was in foreclosure. His assets were frozen. If he didn't pay, he violated probation. He would go to jail. I went to see Mr. Sterling. I met him in his penthouse office, a space of glass and steel that overlooked the city. "Mr. Vance," Sterling said, offering me a seat. "I assumed you would come." "I need a loan," I said. I didn't waste time. "For the boy?" Sterling asked. "He tried to rob me, Thomas." "I know," I said, and I stopped him. "I'm asking for an advance." "You said you wanted to be my patron." "I did." "I will build you a library," I said. Floor to ceiling, walnut and cherry, rolling ladders, intricate marquetry, a space for 10,000 books. Sterling raised an eyebrow. "That is a 6-figure job." "I will do it for the 80,000 my son owes the court," I said. "Labor and materials included. I work for free until the debt is paid." Sterling looked at me. He saw the desperation, but he also saw the resolve. He knew he was getting a master craftsman for pennies on the dollar. "Done," he said. He wrote the check on the spot. I walked to the clerk of the court. I paid Patrick's restitution. I didn't do it for him. At least, I told myself I didn't. I did it for Sarah. She wouldn't have wanted her son in a cage. She would have wanted him to have a chance to rebuild, even if he had to do it from the rubble. I didn't tell Patrick I paid it. I let the lawyer tell him. I didn't see my son for 6 months. The silence between us was vast. A cracked foundation can be patched, injected with epoxy and braced with steel, but it will never be as strong as it was before the fracture. The trust was gone. I quit the Obsidian Gallery. I left my uniform in the locker and walked out. I moved out of the basement apartment. With a small stipend from Sterling for startup costs, I rented a cinderblock garage on the edge of town, near the rail yards. It wasn't much. It was cold in the morning and hot in the afternoon. The roof leaked when it rained hard, but it was mine. I bought tools, not new ones. I scoured flea markets and pawn shops. I bought old Stanley planes with rusted soles and restored them. I bought chisels with cracked handles and turned new ones from ash. I started building again. Not cabinets, not at first. I didn't have the heart for big projects yet. I built birdhouses, small, intricate structures. Victorian mansions for wrens, modernist cubes for sparrows. I used scraps of wood I found in dumpsters. It was therapy. The smell of sawdust, acrid oak, sweet pine, spicy cedar was better than any medicine. The sound of the plane slicing through wood, that perfect shock sound, was a meditation. People heard about the story. The news cycle had churned on. But the legend of the engineer artist lingered. People started showing up at the garage door. They wanted tables. They wanted chairs. They wanted a Vance. I had a waiting list a mile long, but I worked slow. I worked for me. I refused to hire an assistant. I refused to expand. I wanted to feel every cut, every sand, every joint. I was lonely. The nights were long. I ate my dinner on the workbench, looking at the photos of Sarah I had tacked up on the pegboard. "We survived, Sarah," I would whisper to the empty shop. The house is gone, but the foundation held. Then came the knock. It was a Tuesday in November, a gray, slate-colored Tuesday that seeped into the bones. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, a relentless, cold drizzle that turned the dirt road leading to my workshop into a slurry of mud. My shop was a rented garage, at the end of an industrial cul-de-sac. It had corrugated tin walls that rattled in the wind, and a concrete floor stained with the oil of the mechanics who had been here before me. It wasn't the warm, oak-scented studio I had owned for 30 years. It was cold. I had to wear fingerless gloves to keep my knuckles from stiffening up, but it was honest. I was standing at my workbench, a heavy slab of maple propped up on sawhorses. I was hand sanding the top. Sh, sh, sh. The sound was hypnotic. It was the rhythm of my life now, the grit of the sandpaper cutting down the high spots, smoothing out the rough patches, revealing the grain hidden beneath. I was focused on a knot in the wood, a flaw that I was turning into a feature, when I heard a sound over the drumming of the rain. A knock. Not on the door, but on the metal frame of the open bay. I didn't look up. I didn't break my rhythm. "We're closed," I called out. My voice was raspy from disuse. I hadn't spoken to anyone since the hardware store clerk 3 days ago. Waiting list is 6 months out. "Hi, Dad." The voice was quiet. Rough. It sounded like it had been dragged through gravel. My hand froze mid-stroke. The sandpaper bit into the wood. For a moment, I considered not turning around. I considered telling him to leave. The wound he had inflicted was deep. It was a structural crack in the foundation of my trust, and engineers know that once a foundation cracks, you condemn the building. But I was also a father, and biology is a stubborn architect. I put the sanding block down. I brushed the sawdust from my apron. I turned around. Patrick stood in the threshold, framed by the gray curtain of rain. He looked different. The man who had stood on the stage at the Obsidian Gallery in a tailored tuxedo was gone. The soft, corporate accountant with the manicured fingernails and the nervous sweat was gone. The man standing before me was gaunt. His face was thin, the cheekbones sharp under a layer of stubble. He looked 10 years older, yet somehow, for the first time in his life, he looked like a child again. He was wearing work boots that were caked in red mud. His jeans were frayed at the hems and covered in drywall dust. He wore a heavy flannel shirt that had seen better days, the elbows worn thin. He was holding his hat in his hands, wringing the brim. "Patrick," I said. The name tasted strange in my mouth. He didn't step inside. He stood in the rain, letting it soak his shoulders. I brought you some wood," he said. He gestured to the ground beside him. Leaning against the metal doorframe was a slab of dark, rough-sawn timber. "It's black walnut," he said, his voice hitching slightly. "From the job site. The foreman was going to burn it. Said it was too twisted to frame with. I thought you could save it." He picked it up. He grunted with the effort. It was a heavy piece. He walked forward slowly, stepping into the dry circle of the workshop light. He moved like a stray dog that expects to be kicked. He placed the wood on the end of my bench. I looked at it. It was a chaotic piece of timber, twisted grain, leaf edge, covered in dirt. But I saw what he saw. I saw the deep, chocolate heartwood. I saw the potential for a table or a bowl or a sculpture. "It's good wood," I said, running a thumb over the rough bark. Straight grain in the center. No rot. "Yeah," Patrick whispered. "No rot." Silence stretched between us. It wasn't the comfortable silence of a shared workspace. It was heavy, loaded with the weight of court dates, prison sentences, and betrayals. The air felt pressurized. "I'm framing houses now," Patrick said suddenly, blurring the words out. "Over in the new development on the west side, carrying lumber, hauling trash, swinging a hammer." I looked at his hands. They were raw, the knuckles were scabbed. His left thumbnail was black from a missed strike. "Honest work," I said. "Hard work," he replied. He looked at his hands, ashamed of them, yet proud of the pain. "I wake up hurting. I go to sleep hurting. But I sleep for the first time in years. Dad, I sleep." He looked up at me. His eyes were clear. The panicked haze of the debt was gone. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said. His voice cracked, fracturing under the strain. I lost my way. I let myself become something I hated. I tried to build a life on a lie. "You can't build a house on a lie, son," I said softly. "Whatever you put on top of it, money, status, reputation, it just adds weight. And eventually gravity wins. It always collapses." "I know," he said. Tears welled in his eyes, but he didn't wipe them away. "I'm starting over, from the bottom, digging the footings." I looked at the piece of walnut he brought. I looked at the sanding block on the table. I looked at my son. He was broken. He was bankrupt. He was a felon on probation, but he was standing. He was here. He had walked through the rain to bring me a piece of wood, because he knew it is the only language I still spoke. I picked up the sanding block. This table isn't going to finish itself, I said gruffly, and my shoulders are getting old. The arthritis is flaring up in this damp. Patrick looked up. Surprise and a desperate, fragile hope filled his eyes. Really? Grab a block from the shelf, I said, pointing to the wall of tools. 120 grit. Don't go across the grain, or I'll throw you out into the rain. He smiled. It was a small, hesitant thing. A real smile. Yes, sir. He walked to the shelf. He knew where the sandpaper was. He grabbed a block. He walked back to the bench and stood opposite me. He placed the block on the wood. We worked in silence. Sh, 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 sh. The sound doubled, the rhythm synchronized. The sawdust rose into the air, a fine golden mist that settled on our clothes, on our hair, on the floor. It covered the gray concrete. It covered the silence. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. Forgiveness is a finish that takes time to cure. It requires layers, applied patiently, with sanding in between. But it was a start. It was a footing. I was Thomas Vance, the engineer, the maker. I looked at the wood. I looked at my son working the grain, sweating, focusing. My hands were full, and for the first time in a long time, the structure felt sound. Thanks for walking this journey with us all the way. This story was about the difference between appearing strong and being strong, about the difference between veneer and solid wood. With Thomas and Patrick in mind, I have a question for you. Was this ending the right path? Should Thomas have let Patrick rot in jail to learn his lesson fully? Or is the opportunity for redemption through hard work the ultimate act of fatherhood? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed The Silent Foundation, hit like and share it with someone who appreciates the craft.